We was always together. I just loved her. I just loved being around her. I threw her baby shower and she threw my baby shower. We couldn't get no closer than what we was.
There were at least 15 to 20 people involved in the mass brawl.
Fists are flying. Hair is being pulled.
I'm sitting on the ground holding my sister, and she's saying she cannot breathe. I cannot breathe.
He was just mean to me. Every morning he'd mess with me and my brother.
This really comes down to moms protecting their children.
She came off her porch with the knife, ready to fight.
This isn't an ordinary response. This is a fierce need for payback.
I don't know how it escalated so quick, but everything just went wild. Everything just went wild.
The streets of Euclid, Ohio, are busy with kids arriving home from school.
Euclid's a really nice suburb of Cleveland. A lot of families move there, hoping to get away from the city life. It's a little quieter, a bedroom community.
In 2005, the neighborhood was very vibrant. Houses were nice, clean, pretty middle class, and very good people living there.
Just after 4 p.m., 911 dispatchers with the Euclid Police Department receive a call about a disturbance on Crystal Avenue.
There was screaming and chaos and mayhem in the background, so much so that the 911 operator had trouble hearing what was actually being said.
The caller told the police that just outside of their neighbor's house, there were at least 15 people fighting. The sounds of yelling and violence were filling the streets. It is pure pandemonium.
So as the police arrive, the fight is still in full effect with at least 15 to 20 people in the front yard involved in the mass brawl.
Fists are flying. Hair is being pulled.
There were children, there were adults. It was just chaos on Crystal Ave.
And so the only thing to do was intervene as they could.
They're trying to separate people, pull them apart, and that's when they see a young woman laying on the ground and she's bleeding out.
I remember seeing my sister on the ground like, what's wrong with you? And, lift up her shirt, you just see blood.
The woman clutching her wounds is 20-year-old Vanessa McMorrick.
When the EMS went to treat Vanessa on the scene, they found that she had been stabbed.
I'm sitting on the ground holding my sister, and she's saying she cannot breathe. I cannot breathe.
Born on April 5th, 1985, Vanessa McMorrick was raised in a large family in Cleveland.
My mother had 6 kids, 3 boys and 3 girls. Vanessa was the baby of the family. There's 10 years between the both of us. We was always together, going to thrift stores with my mother. We was always together. Yes, she was very helpful as a little child, but she was just a tattleteller. You do something, she'd run to mom and tell, just little stuff, little sister stuff. But as she got older, she got better. We became good, best of sisters. Vanessa, she loved singing. She loved dancing. She loved styling. She was into clothes very, very much, and into tennis shoes too. She loved getting her hair done, her nails done. Yeah, she was a girly girl. I just loved her. I just loved being around her. You know what I'm saying? She's always positive, nothing negative coming out, out her mouth. She was loved by everybody. I was 17 when I had my first baby, so she probably was 7. Diamond Barkley is my daughter.
Vanessa and Christina were very close, but Vanessa also enjoyed being with Christina's children, particularly Diamond, her daughter.
Auntie Nessa was like my sister. Whenever I needed her, I could talk to her. When I was afraid to talk to mom about something, Auntie Nessa was there to listen. She made you happy. So even if it was something going on, you couldn't be upset. Vanessa and Diamond, who's Christina's daughter, were really close.
because, again, Vanessa was the youngest sister, and she was the fun aunt, and so her nieces and nephews looked up to her.
By the time she was a teenager, Vanessa's role in the family was clear.
She was the life of the party. She planned the parties for us. Like, she was that person. She just made it a big thing to keep the family together. All my aunties, all my uncles, we were all close. But Auntie Nessa is the reason that we were all close.
That's why we say she was the glue to the family.
But soon, Vanessa would be starting a family of her own.
Vanessa was 15 when she fell in love. It was around 2002 when we found out she was pregnant. We wasn't happy at first, but it grew on us. It's a baby.
Oh, Auntie Nessa needed a baby. She loved kids, and she was the best mom. I remember them being both happy because my mom and her were pregnant at the same time.
It was wonderful being pregnant with Vanessa. I threw her baby shower and she threw my baby shower. We couldn't get no closer than what we was. Being pregnant together, we were so happy.
By then, Christina, Diamond, and the rest of her family had left Cleveland for the suburb of Euclid.
Christina moved to Euclid and lived there for several years. It was a small and a quiet community that she thought would be a good place to raise her family. She had several children. She had extended family who liked to come over there. And so she really looked to get away from the hustle and the bustle of the city of Cleveland.
When we first moved out in Euclid, yes, we was happy because where we came from, you're trying to, do better for your kids, get a better schooling for your kids. So Euclid was pretty good to us. The family, they would come over and visit me, and I would go over to their house and visit them. It's vice versa. We all went to each other's house.
A couple months after turning 18, Vanessa gave birth to a son.
All of us was helping her with the baby. My mother was helping her the most with the baby. She lived with my mother with the baby. Her and the baby father lived with my mother for a minute, and then they got their own place.
Vanessa was living in downtown Cleveland in the same building with her child's father, and they were working together as a unit.
For the next 2 years, Vanessa settled into the responsibilities that came with being a mother.
She was working at a clothing store, and she was actually doing pretty good for herself.
She was into fashion, but I don't know if she was going to go to school for fashion. She was still so young. She didn't decide what she wanted yet. She was just more focused on just, paying her bills, going to work, and taking care of her son.
The 20-year-old stayed connected to her family, especially to Christina and Diamond, who were a short distance away in Euclid.
She just was at our house all the time. She had her own apartment downtown Cleveland. But she used to get on a bus and come to our house and just, spend nights, spend days. Our house was the hub.
But on the afternoon of April 27, 2005, Christina holds her baby sister in her arms as Vanessa is tended to by paramedics on the street where Christina lives.
They made all of us go in, all the kids, we had to go in the house. My dad shut the door. They're outside. They told us not to come outside, so I didn't know what else was happening after that. I remember ambulances and police.
So they put her into the ambulance, and then I just started feeling burning on my back. They saw that I was stabbed.
I guess because of adrenaline or because of concern for her sister, Christina didn't even know she was stabbed in her back.
So they put me in the ambulance. I'm not worried about me. I'm worried more about my sister and thinking more about her son.
As the ambulances race away, the officers try to restore order.
There were at least 15 to 20 people, males, females, children, parents, grandparents, everybody in the front yard involved in the mass brawl. So their first order of business, number one, was to break up people still engaged in the fight. As the police started to get the party separated, several people stated that the person that had stabbed Vanessa was in the house.
And so police then go into the home.
You still want to approach the person with caution, which is paramount. You would go in to make sure that there's nothing in the immediate vicinity to harm you.
The police were obviously cautious and entered the home with guns drawn.
A peaceful suburban street descends into chaos as a violent melee leaves 20-year-old Vanessa McMorrick with multiple stab wounds. Her sister, Christina, is also injured.
Vanessa is the more serious. Actually, Christina didn't even know she was stabbed in her back. It turns out to be a shallow wound. They were both taken to Hillcrest Hospital. Vanessa was taken into surgery to try and save her life.
She had been stabbed in her chest and pulmonary artery. They needed to take care of her right now if they want to try to save her.
Back on Crystal Avenue, police enter a home where a witness stated the suspect responsible for the stabbings is hiding out.
The person they were speaking of was Ashley Berger. The police did go to the house, and Ashley was in the house.
While an officer takes the 32-year-old into custody, he spots something out of the corner of his eye.
And they find a giant steak knife in the sink. There was a little bit of blood there, but it looks like Ashley had been trying to wash the blood off.
When the police came in, they wanted to know from Ashley, was that the knife that was used to stab Christina and Vanessa? And Ashley simply said, I don't know.
Ashley was a pretty calm, quiet young lady as well. Rather small in stature, but she was really calm and cool.
So at this point, police collected the knife and put it into evidence.
They wanted to determine if this was the knife that was used.
Ashley was taken to the police station for further questioning.
Outside the house, detectives learn from bystanders that Ashley and Christina are neighbors.
Ashley Berger moved into the home next door to Christina around 2004. So about maybe a year after Christina and her family had moved in. The two families are living right next door to each other. They both have large, extended families.
And those two families were the ones involved in the brawl.
It was a conflict between these two families, these neighbors.
While the fighting has stopped, investigators find that tension is still running high.
Everybody was pointing at each other. Ashley's side was blaming Christina and Vanessa. Christina and Vanessa's side was blaming Ashley's side.
On one side, Christina's family is stating that Ashley's family initiated the whole situation and that Ashley came outside wielding a knife at them. On the other side, Ashley's family was saying that, no, it wasn't like that, that Christina's family initiated the situation and they were trying to attack them.
It was obvious that it wasn't going to be easy to get to the bottom of what was going on here.
So they had to take them somewhere where the police were in control, and where that was the Euclid Police Station.
Police transport family members from both sides to the station. A violent crimes detective heads out to check on Vanessa and Christina.
Upon arriving at the hospital, he had found out that Vanessa was rushed to surgery and was not able to get a statement from her.
Christina, however, can talk, having received stitches to a shallow stab wound in her back.
Christina recounted her side of what happened on Crystal Avenue.
It was my daughter's birthday that weekend, so we went to the store to get her outfit for her birthday.
Auntie Nessa was there for my birthday. She was there to help me pick out outfits.
We pull into the driveway. My neighbor, Ashley Berger, she had already called a whole bunch of people over, and they're sitting on the porch. Her mother, her father, her brother, I don't know if it was his girlfriend, her baby father, his mother was over there, who's a nurse. It was her, and then her kids.
Christina indicated to the detective at that point in time, Matt Ashley's boyfriend, was yelling at her and Vanessa.
So we're getting out the car, and he come and get in my sister's face. And I'm telling him, we don't got no problem. We don't need no problems.
He's just getting louder and getting closer and closer to her face, and he's like yelling at her.
According to Christina, her 15-year-old nephew came out of her house and tried to intervene by stepping in between Vanessa and Matt.
Matt knocks my nephew on the floor and is up there hitting on him.
And that, she says, started the fight.
And at that point in time, everybody's running out of their house and it becomes a big brawl.
I don't know how it escalated so quick, but everything just went wild. All I know is I'm in the middle of all these people pulling my hair and doing all this stuff.
In the midst of the chaos, she heard someone call out.
She has a knife. She has a knife.
Christina says she saw Ashley run out the house, yelling and screaming and wielding a knife, swinging it wildly.
According to Christina, she goes up and she grabs Ashley's knife, trying to stop her from stabbing her.
I'm just holding the knife while she still had a grip to it.
But she had to let go.
Ashley's family was yelling for her to get inside, and at this point, Christina starts to turn away.
While Christina is walking away, she sees her sister Vanessa holding her chest, and then all of a sudden she collapses.
Christina felt as though she had been punched in the back, that indeed she had been stabbed.
Everything was in slow motion. What was going through my head is like, is my sister okay?
Christina laid out what happened during the melee. But investigators wanted to know more. They want to know why.
So Christina, at the hospital, she went back and recounted all this stuff that she says led up to today.
She's a very ugly person. There's no talking to no ugly person.
A neighborhood disturbance in Euclid, Ohio, leaves 20-year-old Vanessa McMorrick's life hanging in the balance. While doctors operate, investigators ask Vanessa's sister, Christina, to explain what led to the fight on Crystal Avenue.
Christina had been living in Euclid, Ohio with her fiance and her 5 children.
When I moved to Euclid, it was wonderful. Everything was good. We had just moved from Wayside over in Cleveland, so we moved to a better neighborhood for the kids, a better school system, so I was happy.
In the summer of 2004, Ashley Berger moved in next door with her boyfriend, Matt, and her 4 young children.
When they moved in, I had my hands full with my children. I paid no attention to what she was doing nor her family was doing.
Ashley didn't make it her business to try to be super friendly with the neighbors, but no real problems initially.
Christina says that changed in the fall.
It seems that trouble first started brewing when Christina's daughter, Diamond, was going to school with Ashley's son.
At first, he was nice. He liked to ride the bikes with us and everything, but then he just started getting aggressive. He used to pull my hair, he used to pull my hood, and I think he was picking on me because he liked me. The little boy, little girl crush thing that happens when you're younger, but I did not like boys at the time. I was not into dating. I wanted to play.
So as it progressed, he became a bully to her. He started to harass her.
He was just mean to me and my brother. Every morning, he'd mess with me and my brother. There was one day we were standing at the bus stop waiting for the bus, and he grabbed a snowball, but it wasn't snow. It was like an ice ball because the snow was melting. And then he threw it at my face and left me with a nice big red mark. That's when I started telling my mom.
Christina, being the mother she is, tried to go over to Ashley's house and tell her, hey, this is what's happening. You know, tell your son, you know, to stop bothering my daughter.
I do remember saying, I do not want to turn this into a you and I situation. Let's try to handle this like parents. Let's not take it nowhere else.
But according to Christina, Ashley did not share her desire to be civil.
She had an ugly attitude from the start.
She was the typical protective parent and saying that her son wasn't capable of this, so she rejected everything that Christina was saying.
Christina says that tension between the two mothers continued to build. In February 2005, it came to a head.
Christina went to confront Ashley about certain behaviors involving the children again.
She didn't answer her door. So from walking back from her porch, I saw her boyfriend, Matthew, walking down the street.
She approached him to talk to him about the situation. Ashley sees the discussion. She runs outside.
Apparently, Ashley accuses Christina of flirting with her boyfriend.
She said, don't talk to her man, so it sounded like jealousy.
She hit my mom in her face, and my mom ended up on top of her, like punching her, everything.
After that, police were called, but no one was arrested, and the police told them to go back to their separate homes and just to leave each other alone.
I actually went up to go press charges on her at the Euclid police station. They said, well, there's nothing we can do about it because you hit her back. You press charges on her, she can press charges on me, and we can both go to jail.
Now, tensions between the two families continued to escalate from daily threats and talks of violence. Both parents were playing a mama bear role. And if you know anything about being a mama bear, you are protective of your cubs.
If you harm a mother's child, that mama bear instinct is not only to protect her child, it's about payback.
It started getting really bad.
When we got out the car, and if you even stepped in their grass, it started an argument. It started a huge fight. It's minor things like that that triggered everything else.
Christina says the police were called on a regular basis.
It got to a point where we started calling the police so much that they said that they was gonna arrest us for calling so much and coming out there so much, yes. So I stopped calling them after that.
With all this back and forth between the families and all these wild incidents, it made Christina say, you know what? I can't take this. I gotta get out of here.
We was about to be out that summer, and then this happened.
During the interview, a doctor arrives with an update on Vanessa's condition.
The doctor came in there and said, I'm sorry to tell you, your sister passed away. I just couldn't believe it. Yeah, I was in shock. I'm still in shock. I'm gonna always be in shock.
So what was once a domestic disturbance is now a homicide.
It becomes a big deal when you go from a neighborhood spat to a full-out brawl to somebody being dead. It's no longer about, is someone going to be arrested, but who's going to be arrested and when are they going to be arrested?
In Ohio, 20-year-old Vanessa McMorrick has just succumbed to stab wounds she suffered during a street brawl involving two feuding families.
Vanessa, she had been stabbed once through her lung and through her pulmonary artery. These things essentially caused Vanessa to bleed out.
Vanessa's sister, Christina, points to Christina's neighbor, 32-year-old Ashley Berger, as the person who wielded the knife. Christina says the feud that led to the fight was between her and Ashley, not Vanessa and Ashley.
It wasn't Nessa's business. She didn't have nothing to do with this, so I didn't ever bring her into the situation.
Following the interview with Christina, detectives go back to the Euclid Police Department, where Ashley Berger waits in an interrogation room.
So as the officers go in to question Ashley, it was made known to her that Vanessa had passed. And in what police terms is known as an excited utterance,
she blurted out, "I didn't mean to do it."
Ashley launches her own version of what led to the fight.
Ashley felt that Christina's daughter, Diamond, was the aggressor and that Christina's nephews were also harassing her son, not the other way around.
Ashley says she had contacted the police several times to report bullying and harassment. And Ashley even tried to obtain a restraining order against Christina.
The police told her pretty much that, unfortunately, with all the bickering and arguing back and forth, it fell under the Freedom of Speech Act, so she really didn't have a case.
The morning before the stabbing, she tried one last time to put a stop to the feud.
Ashley told police that she didn't want things to go this far. She was trying to prevent all of this. But on April 27th, Ashley Berger called police once again because she said that Christina's nephews were harassing her son at the bus stop.
The officer goes to Christina's home to talk to her about this, but she's not there.
Christina, in fact, had been out with Vanessa and Diamond preparing for Diamond's upcoming birthday party.
So police go back to Ashley and tell Ashley, listen, we tried to talk to Christina. She wasn't home. You guys just stay away from each other. If anything else happens, give us a call.
Ashley says she called her parents and other family members to her home for support. They gathered on her front porch.
That's when everything started to happen. Vanessa and Christina arrived home back from the store. That is when the fight ensued.
During this whole battle, Ashley is inside the house trying to protect her children. She sees her parents fighting.
Ashley says she was scared for her family and her baby.
Ashley revealed that she was 5 months pregnant.
So she grabbed a knife and went outside and she held it up really high and said, "Hey, everybody get the F out of my yard. Get out of here." And she wanted to make sure that they saw it and try to scare them off.
Ashley indicates to the police that Vanessa and Christina approached her home and were on her porch.
Christina and Vanessa run at her saying, "We're not scared of you." And they came right at her.
They stated that they were gonna not only kill her, but stomp the baby out of her as well.
According to Ashley, there was a struggle between Ashley and Christina over the knife.
During that same time, she said Vanessa was pulling her hair. So now Ashley is just trying to reach down and swing down on both of them to get loose. And that's possibly how they could have got stabbed. And once they finally let her go, she said she walked back in the house.
Ashley told investigators that she did not know if she had stabbed Vanessa and Christina, and if she did, she didn't know that she did.
Ashley was very vehement about it being self-defense. Matter of fact, she stated she never even left the porch.
Detectives believe that Ashley did stab the two women during the fight. But the question is, did she mean to?
Was Ashley intentional in trying to harm and kill Vanessa and Christina? Or was she just the mother that was trying to protect her unborn child?
Investigators turn to the family members from both sides who have come to the station for questioning.
So detectives have their work cut out for them. They're interviewing all of these people at Euclid headquarters and trying to find out exactly how all of this started.
I'm sure every detective in Euclid was on duty that night, even if they had to call people in, to make sure they got accurate statements, because the fresher it is, the more accurate it's going to be.
As police were trying to get to the bottom of how all of this started, they were hearing conflicting stories.
Christina's older nephew said that the fight started when he saw Matt, Ashley's boyfriend, in Vanessa's face. He walked over to Matt and wanted Matt to leave Vanessa alone. At this point, Matt grabs Del Monte, puts him in the headlock, and begins punching him in the face.
Now, Matt had a different side of the story. He was saying that when Vanessa and Christina came up, they started yelling and arguing and everything, and then even spit in his face, and that's what initiated the whole altercation.
The story seems to follow along the same path. The exception is both sides are blaming each other for the escalation.
With blame flying and fingers pointing, detectives must turn elsewhere for answers.
The investigators had to really get more information and really cross-check everybody's accounts. And they had to use evidence to see what happened.
Euclid police believe that Ashley Berger stabbed Vanessa McMorrick during a brawl, leading to her death. They must determine whether Ashley acted out of self-defense or out of a vengeful and intentional rage. Investigators turn to evidence for answers.
At the scene, the police did retrieve the knife as the evidence in the sink.
So they got that, and that's one piece of evidence that they can use to try to figure out this case.
It was eventually tested, and according to lab reports, they weren't able to get any traces off of the knife. She had cleaned the knife off.
But the knife isn't the only evidence investigators have.
There were pictures included in the crime scene package of bloodstains outside the home.
The location of the blood became very important. It's all going to come down to where the blood was at.
According to Ashley, the stabbing happened just outside her door on the porch.
She stabbed him in self-defense only when Christina and Vanessa came onto her porch.
But when they looked at the crime scene photos, they saw a pool of blood in front of the living room window.
The living room window was down a ways from the actual porch.
There's no evidence of blood on the porch. So it was confirmed by the evidence of the blood pool that the stabbing more likely occurred under the window.
That leads them to believe that she came off the porch, meaning that she would have went towards Christina and Vanessa. So now they think that it's possible that this was not self-defense. This was a direct, intentional attack against Christina and Vanessa.
The autopsy delivers another strike against Ashley.
The coroner's office indicated that there were at least 7 stab wounds to Vanessa.
Multiple stab wounds is more indicative of anger or rage rather than self-defense. And in this case, Vanessa had 7, not just 1.
The type of wounds to her body were not just incidental knife slashes. As Ashley said, she was just flailing the knife around. But it was more indicative of targeted strikes to Vanessa. And that could be, ascertained by the angle of the knife, the deepness of the piercings, and the whole bit.
The stab wound that ultimately killed her was about 3 inches deep and was well into her chest cavity.
Another piece of evidence was Ashley stabbed Christina in the back, meaning that Christina was walking away. If it was self-defense, why would you stab somebody in the back?
After the detectives found or gathered as much evidence as they did, it was decided that Ashley Berger was going to be arrested.
On June 2nd, 2005, Ashley was formally indicted. She was indicted on aggravated murder charges as well as several counts of felonious assault. After the incident, Ashley remained in jail for about 80 days prior to her posting bond. As a condition of her bond, Ashley was to remain on house arrest until she gave birth to her child. She was staying with her mom rather than going back to her house in Euclid.
After the entire fight that night, when my aunt lost her life, I don't remember them ever being home ever again. I never seen their van. I didn't see them move. They just were not there anymore.
On August 29th, 4 months after the stabbing, Ashley gives birth to her little girl.
In the months that follow, Ashley stands by her self-defense claim. On November 7th, 2005, she goes on trial for murdering Vanessa and assaulting Christina.
Really what it came down to was self-defense a viable legal argument?
In November, Ashley Berger's trial begins in a Cleveland courtroom.
The prosecutors portrayed Ashley as being angry and wanting revenge, and that her intention in getting that knife was to harm Christina and Vanessa.
The prosecutor said that Ashley was the only person involved in the fight with a weapon, and she went outside to do harm.
But the one thing that he really focused on was the fact that she had time to decide to do something different, and she chose to go get the knife, and as a result, one person is dead.
They also focused on where the pool of blood was located on the scene.
Ashley had initially claimed that this happened on her porch, but the photos clearly show that the pool of blood was outside the living room window.
The pool of blood was proof that Ashley wasn't just on her porch in a self-defense stance, that she came off her porch with the knife ready to fight.
This isn't an ordinary response. This is a fierce need for payback.
The defense team argues that Ashley grabbed the knife to prevent violence, not inflict it.
She came outside with a knife because she saw them attacking her mom, so she was just trying to scare them off.
As well as to protect her baby.
The defense called multiple witnesses, mostly Ashley's family members who were there on scene that day, and they did testify that Vanessa and Christina were not only threatening Ashley, but her unborn child.
During her testimony, Ashley claims that Vanessa repeatedly threatened to kick the baby out of her.
The defense tried to make the point that she was in imminent danger and that her motivation was to protect her family.
They claimed that she was a terrified mother who just simply sought to protect her unborn child.
But Christina takes the stand to refute those claims.
Ashley Berger's a full liar. What you mean kick the baby out her stomach? We didn't even know she was pregnant. They trying to find anything to get her out of her situation. They're trying to make her seem innocent in any type of way, and she's not innocent at all.
After nearly 2 weeks of testimony, the state rests. On November 21st, 2005, the jury comes to a decision.
The jury was not totally convinced by either side. However, they did convict Ashley of lesser charges.
Ashley Berger was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, and aggravated assault for the attack on Vanessa and Christina. Manslaughter means that you did cause the death, but it wasn't planned or it wasn't necessarily intentional, but a person still died. The judge has discretion as to how to be fair to everybody. And I guess he believed that giving her 5 years was a stiff enough penalty. Now, I would dare say if you talk to Christina and Vanessa's family, they would say she didn't get enough time.
My mom was stabbed in her back and my aunt was stabbed 7 times. You weren't defending yourself at that point. She should have definitely gotten more than what she had.
No, justice wasn't served. Heat of passion, 5 years. No, it wasn't served. They was feeling sorry for her. First time offense, mother, she wanted to be home with her kids. That's really sad. I don't understand that, but I guess it ain't for me to understand.
As a defense attorney, this case has lots of layers, but this really comes down to emotional moms protecting their children.
This was layers, an evolution of payback, back and forth.
December 11th, 1978, did not begin as the kind of day that people remember for generations. It arrived quietly over the northwest suburbs of Chicago, carrying the familiar weight of an Illinois winter. The morning sky was wrapped in thick gray clouds that seemed to press low over rows of modest houses, shopping centers, and narrow streets lined with leafless trees. Cars rolled across damp pavement. Store owners unlocked their doors. Parents hurried children toward school before heading to work. Nothing about the day hinted that it would become one of the darkest turning points in American criminal history. By the afternoon, holiday decorations glowed in storefront windows. Strings of colored lights hung above sidewalks, trying to push back the early darkness that always came too soon in December. Christmas music drifted softly from department stores, mixing with the sound of traffic and distant conversations. Families were thinking about presents, school vacations, and dinners waiting at home. Life moved with comforting predictability. Then, somewhere between ordinary errands and evening routines, a 15-year-old boy disappeared. His name was Robert Piest. At first, there was nothing dramatic about his absence. Teenagers changed plans. They stayed out later than expected. They forgot to call home. In thousands of households across America, worried parents had spent anxious evenings waiting for children who eventually walked through the front door with an apology and an explanation. But this night would be different. Robert had been working at a local pharmacy. He was responsible, polite, and known as the kind of teenager adults trusted without hesitation. He wasn't someone who simply vanished without telling anyone where he was going. Earlier that day, he had mentioned an opportunity that sounded promising. A local contractor had supposedly offered him a better-paying job, and Robert intended to speak with the man before returning home. It sounded like a conversation that might last only a few minutes. No one imagined it would be the last confirmed plan anyone would ever hear him make. As the evening grew colder, the hours stretched painfully for his family. Every glance toward the driveway ended in disappointment. Every passing car raised hope before fading into silence. Phone calls brought no answers. Friends hadn't seen him. Co-workers assumed he had left normally. There was no argument, no sign of rebellion, no obvious reason for him to disappear voluntarily. A growing sense of unease settled over the Piest household. It was the kind of feeling impossible to explain yet impossible to ignore. Outside, Christmas lights continued blinking across neighborhood windows. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Television sets filled living rooms with holiday specials and evening news broadcasts. The world continued exactly as it always had, completely unaware that one family's reality had begun to fracture. When Robert's disappearance was reported, it entered the system like many missing person cases before it. Law enforcement officers collected the basic facts, asked familiar questions, and started with the simplest explanations. Was he staying with friends? Had he decided to leave home? Had there been a misunderstanding about where he planned to go? Those possibilities had to be considered because, statistically, they were the most likely. Yet almost immediately, something about this case felt different. Robert had left behind too many ordinary things. His future plans. His family. His routines. Nothing suggested he intended to disappear. Those who knew him described a teenager with goals, responsibilities, and close relationships. He had every reason to return home. That realization quietly transformed concern into urgency. Investigators began retracing the final hours anyone could account for. Each conversation became another piece of an incomplete puzzle. Co-workers described the end of his shift. Witnesses remembered brief encounters. Small details, insignificant on their own, slowly formed a timeline. Every minute mattered. Somewhere along that timeline appeared the name of a local businessman. John Wayne Gacy. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about him. He owned a successful construction business. He employed young workers. He was active in community organizations. Neighbors saw him as outgoing, energetic, and dependable. He attended social events, spoke comfortably with strangers, and projected the confidence of someone who belonged wherever he happened to be. To many people, he represented success. He had built the kind of reputation that naturally lowered suspicion. People trusted him. Parents trusted him. Young men looking for work trusted him. That trust would later become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire investigation. There were no warning sirens attached to his name in the minds of those around him. No visible signs that would cause an average person to cross the street or refuse an invitation. He blended effortlessly into suburban life, surrounded by neighbors who mowed their lawns, hosted backyard gatherings, and exchanged holiday greetings over fences. His home on Summerdale Avenue looked remarkably ordinary. The house did not stand apart from the others nearby. It wasn't abandoned or isolated. Children rode bicycles through the neighborhood. Families celebrated birthdays and holidays within sight of its walls. Delivery trucks arrived. Friends visited. Workers came and went. It existed in plain view. Perhaps that was the most unsettling detail of all. History often teaches us to imagine monsters hiding in distant places, separated from everyday life by obvious warning signs. Reality is rarely so considerate. Sometimes extraordinary evil occupies the most ordinary address on the block, concealed behind routines that appear almost comforting. Investigators did not know that yet. To them, John Wayne Gacy was simply a man connected to the last known movements of a missing teenager. Nothing more. Nothing less. The questions were straightforward. Had Robert met him? What had they discussed? Where had Robert gone afterward? The answers should have been simple. Instead, every attempt to clarify the timeline seemed to create new uncertainty. As detectives continued their work, another quiet truth remained hidden beneath the surface. Robert Piest was not the first young man to disappear in the Chicago area. Over the years, families had reported sons who never returned home. Some had been runaways. Some had drifted between temporary jobs. Others had simply vanished, leaving behind bedrooms that remained untouched for months, then years. Missing person reports accumulated across different jurisdictions, often investigated separately, rarely connected into a larger pattern. At the time, no one could see the invisible thread linking them together. Each family experienced its own private tragedy. Each investigation seemed isolated. Each unanswered question slowly disappeared beneath newer cases and passing time. The silence surrounding those disappearances had become almost routine. No headlines united them. No single detective possessed every file. No one yet understood that the story stretching beneath Chicago's suburbs was far larger than a single missing teenager. Robert's disappearance would become the event that forced those scattered fragments together. Like the first crack spreading across a frozen lake, it seemed small at the moment it appeared. Only later would people realize the entire surface had already been weakening for years. And somewhere, hidden behind the ordinary rhythms of suburban life, a secret waited beneath the floorboards of a quiet house, buried so close to everyday existence that neighbors walked past it without ever imagining what lay only a few feet below their own footsteps. Chicago in the 1970s was a city built on contradictions. Towering office buildings reflected ambition and prosperity, while only a few miles away, neighborhoods carried the quiet weight of economic uncertainty. The city itself never truly seemed to stop moving. Freight trains rumbled across steel tracks before dawn. Factory whistles echoed through the cold air. Delivery trucks threaded their way through busy streets long before most families had finished breakfast. It was a place where hard work was part of everyday identity, where people believed that if they kept their heads down and worked long enough, tomorrow would be a little better than today. Beyond the city's crowded downtown, the northwestern suburbs offered something many Americans dreamed about. Tree-lined streets stretched through quiet residential neighborhoods. Single-family homes stood shoulder to shoulder, each with its own neatly trimmed lawn, a driveway filled with family cars, and mailboxes decorated with holiday wreaths every December. Children rode bicycles during the summer, chased baseballs across neighborhood parks, and walked to school with classmates they had known for years. Parents greeted one another while mowing their lawns or shoveling snow from their sidewalks. It was the kind of place where people believed they knew their neighbors. Norwood Park was one of those communities. To outsiders, it represented stability. Families settled there because it felt safe. Schools were respected. Local businesses knew their customers by name. Church services brought familiar faces together every Sunday morning. Little league games filled weekends with laughter and friendly competition. The pace of life was slower than downtown Chicago, and many residents believed they had found a small pocket of predictability in an increasingly complicated world. That sense of security was not accidental. America during the 1970s was living through enormous cultural change. The optimism that had characterized much of the previous decade had begun to fade. The Vietnam War had left lasting scars on thousands of families. Political scandals had shaken public trust in institutions. Inflation affected household budgets, forcing many families to work longer hours simply to maintain the lives they had built. Yet despite those national anxieties, suburban neighborhoods continued to promise something deeply comforting: normalcy. Parents believed they were raising their children in places where danger existed somewhere else. Not here. Not on these streets. Teenagers took after-school jobs at grocery stores, pharmacies, restaurants, and hardware shops. Many hoped to earn enough money for their first car, college tuition, or Christmas presents for their families. Employers often preferred hiring young workers because they were eager, energetic, and willing to learn. Construction companies, landscaping businesses, and small contractors regularly recruited teenagers for part-time work, especially during weekends and school breaks. No one found that unusual. In fact, it was often viewed as a sign of responsibility. Young men learned practical skills. They earned their own money. Parents saw employment as another step toward adulthood. Few imagined that something as ordinary as a job offer could become the beginning of a tragedy. Trust was woven into everyday life in ways that are difficult to imagine decades later. People answered knocks at the front door without hesitation. Children accepted rides from neighbors they had known for years. Employers frequently interviewed applicants in homes or private offices rather than formal corporate settings. Personal recommendations carried enormous weight. If someone appeared respectable, dressed neatly, and had a successful business, most people saw little reason for suspicion. Appearances mattered. And appearances could be remarkably convincing. Among those who seemed to embody suburban success was a local contractor named John Wayne Gacy. By every outward measure, he appeared to have achieved the American dream. His construction business kept him busy with residential remodeling and maintenance projects across the Chicago area. Employees came and went throughout the day, loading equipment into trucks before driving to different job sites. Customers described him as confident and hardworking. He spoke comfortably with clients, negotiated contracts, and projected the image of a businessman who knew exactly what he was doing. His home reflected that same appearance of stability. Located on Summerdale Avenue, it sat among other ordinary houses whose owners worried about mortgages, school grades, holiday shopping, and weekend chores. Nothing about the property demanded special attention. It blended naturally into the neighborhood, almost inviting people to overlook it completely. Neighbors saw construction vehicles parked outside from time to time. Workers arrived early. Friends visited. Life appeared busy but unremarkable. During community events, Gacy often presented himself as outgoing and approachable. He volunteered for local organizations and enjoyed participating in charitable activities. On some occasions, he dressed as a clown character known as Pogo the Clown, entertaining children at fundraising events, hospital visits, and neighborhood celebrations. The colorful costume, oversized shoes, and painted smile projected friendliness rather than fear. Parents smiled. Children laughed. Photographs captured moments that seemed entirely wholesome. Years later, those same images would acquire an unsettling symbolism they never carried at the time. The costume itself was not connected to the crimes, yet the contrast between public image and hidden reality became one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. It challenged a comforting assumption. People often believe danger announces itself clearly. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it introduces itself with a handshake. Inside his business, Gacy maintained authority over a workforce that included young men searching for opportunities. Construction could be demanding work, but it offered immediate income. Teenagers who lacked experience elsewhere often accepted temporary jobs carrying lumber, digging trenches, painting walls, or cleaning worksites. For many, it represented a chance to prove themselves. The relationship between employer and employee naturally involved trust. An employer provided wages. A young worker provided effort. It was a simple exchange repeated across countless businesses every day. Nothing about that arrangement seemed dangerous. Meanwhile, across Chicago and its surrounding suburbs, missing person cases quietly accumulated. Most never attracted significant media attention. When a teenage boy disappeared, investigators first considered familiar explanations. Some young people left home voluntarily after arguments with parents. Others traveled with friends without informing anyone. A few eventually returned after several days, embarrassed but unharmed. Law enforcement agencies worked within the information available to them, and without obvious evidence of foul play, resources were often directed toward cases that appeared more urgent. Communication between jurisdictions also looked very different from what people expect today. There were no nationwide digital databases capable of instantly connecting similar disappearances across multiple counties. Investigators relied heavily on paper files, telephone calls, mailed reports, and personal contacts between departments. Information traveled more slowly, and patterns that seem obvious in hindsight often remained hidden because the necessary pieces were scattered across different offices. Each detective saw only part of the picture. Each missing person report lived inside its own file cabinet. No one realized how many stories shared unsettling similarities. Families carried those unanswered questions alone. Bedrooms remained untouched. School photographs gathered dust on living room shelves. Birthdays arrived without celebration. Parents learned to recognize the sound of every vehicle passing outside, wondering whether this might finally be the moment their son came home. Weeks became months. Months became years. Hope changed shape over time. It never disappeared completely, but it became quieter, more fragile, surviving in small rituals that outsiders rarely noticed. Some mothers continued preparing favorite meals long after everyone understood they would probably never be eaten. Fathers avoided giving away clothing or personal belongings because doing so felt too much like surrender. Their grief existed without certainty. There was no funeral. No final goodbye. Only silence. While those families searched for answers, everyday life continued around them. Holiday decorations appeared each December. Children graduated from high school. Neighbors moved away. New families purchased old houses. The city expanded. Construction crews built new neighborhoods over land that had once been open fields. Time continued moving forward, indifferent to the questions left behind. Looking back now, historians often describe those years as the calm before an unimaginable revelation. But that description exists only because people know how the story ends. At the time, there was no music building toward a climax, no obvious warning sign that history was approaching one of the most horrifying criminal investigations America had ever witnessed. There was only an ordinary suburb, ordinary families, ordinary routines, and the comforting belief that terrible things happened somewhere else. That belief would soon collapse beneath the weight of a truth hidden in plain sight, forcing an entire nation to reconsider how well anyone can truly know the people living just beyond the fence next door. December 11, 1978, began like countless Mondays before it. The morning carried the familiar chill of an Illinois winter, the kind that settled into the air long before sunrise and lingered well after dark. Frost clung to parked cars. Bare tree branches stood motionless against a pale gray sky. Across the northwest suburbs of Chicago, people followed routines that had become almost automatic. Parents hurried toward work. Students gathered their books and jackets before leaving for school. Shop owners unlocked their front doors, switched on fluorescent lights, and prepared for another ordinary business day during the busy holiday season. For 15-year-old Robert Piest, it was supposed to be another step toward adulthood. Friends and family knew him as dependable. He balanced school with part-time work, understood responsibility beyond his years, and rarely gave anyone a reason to worry. Like many teenagers, He had begun imagining what came after high school. Every paycheck represented a little more independence, another small contribution toward future plans that still felt distant but increasingly real. That afternoon, Robert reported to work at the local pharmacy where he held a part-time job. Customers moved in and out, many purchasing holiday gifts, prescriptions, or last-minute necessities before heading home. The store buzzed with the familiar rhythm of December commerce. Registers opened and closed. Shopping bags rustled. Conversations drifted between employees and regular customers who recognized one another by name. Nothing about the day suggested that it would become the final chapter of Robert's ordinary life. As his shift continued, the atmosphere remained routine. Co-workers later remembered nothing unusual about his behavior. He appeared focused, polite, and engaged with the responsibilities expected of him. He greeted customers with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to helping others. To everyone around him, it was simply another workday nearing its end. At some point during the afternoon, however, a new possibility entered the conversation. Robert learned of what appeared to be a promising employment opportunity with a local construction contractor. For a teenager eager to earn more money, the offer sounded attractive. Construction work often paid better than retail jobs, especially for young workers willing to spend weekends or school breaks performing physically demanding tasks. It was not an unusual opportunity. Across suburban America, thousands of teenagers accepted similar jobs every year. Contractors regularly hired young men for seasonal work, remodeling projects, or temporary labor. Parents often encouraged those opportunities because they taught responsibility and provided valuable experience. From every practical perspective, the meeting Robert expected to have seemed completely ordinary. Before leaving work, he mentioned to those around him that he intended to speak briefly with the contractor regarding the potential job. The conversation, as far as anyone knew, would only take a few minutes. Afterward, he planned to return home. There was no indication that he expected anything more than a routine discussion. His family had every reason to believe they would see him that evening. It is often only in hindsight that ordinary moments begin to carry extraordinary weight. A casual goodbye becomes the last farewell. A promise to be home for dinner becomes the final sentence someone remembers hearing. An everyday plan becomes the dividing line between life before and life after. For Robert's family, those ordinary moments would later return with painful clarity. Every small detail became something to revisit. Every remembered conversation became something to examine. Every minute gained a significance no one could have recognized at the time. As daylight faded, December's early darkness settled over the suburbs. Holiday lights flickered to life along neighborhood streets. Traffic thickened as workers began their evening commutes. Families gathered around dinner tables. Televisions filled living rooms with local news and seasonal programming. Inside the Piest household, preparations for an ordinary evening quietly continued. There was every expectation that Robert would soon walk through the front door. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. At first, no alarm followed. Teenagers were occasionally delayed. Conversations lasted longer than expected. Traffic slowed travel. Small inconveniences happened every day. The family waited. Outside, the neighborhood remained unchanged. Children returned from after-school activities. Porch lights illuminated driveways. Neighbors exchanged friendly greetings before disappearing into warm homes as the temperature continued to fall. Still, Robert did not arrive. As the evening stretched on, concern gradually replaced patience. Attempts to determine where he might be produced few answers. Friends had little information beyond what had already been shared earlier in the day. Co-workers believed he had simply left after mentioning the job opportunity. No one could explain why the hours continued passing without any word from him. The uncertainty proved especially unsettling because it conflicted so sharply with Robert's character. Those who knew him consistently described someone who respected his family and understood the importance of keeping his commitments. Disappearing without contacting anyone simply did not fit the young man they knew. That growing contradiction transformed an ordinary delay into something much more troubling. As concern deepened, attention naturally shifted toward retracing Robert's final known movements. Investigators would later reconstruct those hours carefully, comparing witness accounts, checking timelines, and separating confirmed facts from uncertain memories. One detail quickly stood out. The prospective employer Robert intended to meet was John Wayne Gacy, a local contractor whose business frequently employed young workers. At that stage, the information carried no immediate implication of criminal conduct. Detectives routinely identify the last people known to have seen a missing individual because those conversations often help establish a reliable timeline. Sometimes they reveal an innocent explanation. Sometimes they uncover a misunderstanding. Sometimes they simply eliminate possibilities. The process begins with questions rather than conclusions. Who saw the missing person last? Where were they headed? Who expected to meet them? What happened after that? Those questions would soon guide investigators toward a path none of them anticipated. Meanwhile, Robert's disappearance had already begun reshaping the emotional landscape inside his family's home. Hope remained. Fear remained. Neither emotion could yet overcome the other. Every sound outside invited another glance toward the window. Every passing vehicle suggested the possibility that this might finally be the moment everything returned to normal. But normal never came back. As the hours slipped into night, what had begun as an ordinary winter evening quietly transformed into the beginning of a search that would extend far beyond one missing teenager. It would challenge long-held assumptions about trust, expose hidden failures in the way missing person cases were connected, and ultimately lead investigators toward a discovery that would forever alter the history of American criminal investigations. For the moment, however, none of that was visible. There was only a family waiting for someone they loved to come home, believing that the answer to their growing fear had to exist somewhere just beyond the next phone call, the next conversation, or the next knock on the door. They could not yet know that the search for Robert Piest was about to uncover far more than anyone had imagined, revealing a truth that had remained concealed beneath the appearance of an ordinary suburban life for years. The first hours after a person disappears are often defined by uncertainty rather than certainty. Questions outnumber answers. Every possibility seems equally plausible, and hope has not yet surrendered to fear. That was the reality facing the Piest family as December 11th gave way to a long, restless night. The house, which only hours earlier had been filled with the ordinary rhythm of family life, gradually became quieter. Dinner sat untouched longer than anyone expected. Conversations grew shorter. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward the windows, listening for the sound of a car pulling into the driveway or footsteps approaching the front door. Nothing came. Robert had never given his family a reason to believe he would simply disappear without saying a word. He was young, but he had earned a reputation for being dependable. That reputation now deepened the family's concern. Every minute that passed without contact felt increasingly out of character. Phone calls began. Relatives were contacted first, followed by friends and classmates. Each conversation ended with the same disappointing answer. No one had seen Robert since he left work. No one knew where he might have gone after mentioning the meeting about the construction job. Hope still lingered, but it was becoming increasingly fragile. Perhaps he had accepted a ride with someone whose phone number the family did not know. Perhaps the meeting had taken longer than expected. Perhaps there was a simple explanation waiting just beyond the next call. Those possibilities slowly became harder to believe. Outside, the neighborhood remained peaceful. Snow had not fallen that evening, but the cold settled over the quiet streets with unmistakable intensity. Porch lights illuminated empty sidewalks. A few houses still glowed with Christmas decorations, their colorful lights reflecting faintly off parked cars. Behind those windows, families exchanged gifts early, watched television together, or prepared children for bed. The contrast was striking. For most of the neighborhood, it was another ordinary Monday night. For one family, time seemed to have stopped. Eventually, concern became action. Law enforcement was notified, beginning what initially appeared to be a routine missing person investigation. Officers gathered the information available at the time with careful attention. They asked when Robert had last been seen, what he had been wearing, where he had intended to go, and whether there had been any recent disagreements at home or school that might explain his absence. These were standard questions, shaped by years of experience. Many teenagers reported missing eventually returned home safely. Some stayed with friends without informing their parents. Others left temporarily after arguments or misunderstandings. Investigators understood that every case required patience as well as urgency. Yet something about Robert's disappearance resisted those familiar explanations. His family described no serious conflict. His friends could not recall unusual behavior. Co-workers remembered him making plans consistent with returning home. The picture that emerged was one of stability rather than disruption. That distinction mattered. Investigators recognized that understanding a missing person's normal routine often revealed whether an absence represented a voluntary decision or something far more concerning. In Robert's case, the routine had been interrupted abruptly and without explanation. Detectives began assembling a timeline. The process was methodical. They revisited the pharmacy where Robert had worked that afternoon, speaking with employees who had shared the final hours of his shift. Memories were still fresh enough to provide useful details. Co-workers described an ordinary workday interrupted only by Robert's brief discussion about a possible new job opportunity. The opportunity had sounded exciting. For a teenager earning part-time wages, better pay meant more independence. No one questioned his interest in meeting a local contractor to learn more. That meeting soon became the most significant event in the investigation. Witnesses confirmed that Robert had expected to speak with John Wayne Gacy. At this early stage, the information served a practical purpose rather than an accusatory one. Detectives routinely contacted the last known individuals connected to a missing person. Such conversations often helped establish timelines or eliminate misunderstandings before broader searches became necessary. Still, every hour without contact increased the urgency. As investigators continued interviewing witnesses, members of the Piest family faced a different challenge: the exhausting emotional cycle of waiting. Waiting transformed ordinary sounds into moments of anticipation. A telephone ringing could signal good news. Headlights sweeping across the front window might belong to Robert. A knock at the door could bring the explanation everyone desperately wanted. Each moment ended in disappointment. Sleep proved nearly impossible. Instead, family members replayed the day repeatedly, searching their memories for something they might have overlooked. Had Robert mentioned another destination? Had there been a conversation that seemed insignificant at the time but now deserved greater attention? Every remembered detail became subject to new scrutiny. This pattern is familiar to many families whose loved ones vanish unexpectedly. Memory itself becomes an investigation. People begin examining conversations they had never expected to remember. Small choices suddenly feel enormous. Ordinary words acquire extraordinary significance. Meanwhile, detectives expanded their efforts beyond immediate interviews. They examined Robert's known movements, comparing statements from different witnesses to identify consistencies and gaps. Every confirmed sighting narrowed the timeline. Every unanswered question pointed toward the next interview. The process demanded patience. Assumptions could not replace evidence. Rumors, no matter how convincing, required verification before becoming part of the investigation. As the night stretched into the early hours of the next morning, the case remained defined by uncertainty. No confirmed evidence explained Robert's disappearance. No witness had reported seeing him return home. No communication had reached his family. Only one fact grew stronger with every passing hour. His disappearance did not fit the life he had been living. For investigators, that realization slowly shifted the tone of the inquiry. What had begun as a search for a missing teenager increasingly suggested the possibility that something far more serious had occurred. Still, no one could foresee how dramatically the investigation would expand. The questions remained deceptively simple. Where had Robert gone after leaving work? Who had seen him last? Could the meeting about the construction job explain his disappearance, Or was it merely one stop in a much longer chain of events? Those questions would soon draw detectives toward a man whose public image appeared reassuringly ordinary, and whose answers would prove difficult to reconcile with the steadily growing body of evidence. Long before the investigation uncovered the shocking truths hidden beneath an unremarkable suburban home, it was driven by something much simpler: a family's determination not to stop looking, and investigators' refusal to dismiss a disappearance that increasingly defied every ordinary explanation. By the morning of December 12th, the investigation had entered a different phase. What had begun as a missing person report was no longer treated as a simple case of a teenager who had failed to return home. Detectives could not yet explain why Robert Piest had vanished, but they were becoming increasingly convinced that his disappearance demanded immediate attention. Every hour without contact narrowed the range of innocent explanations. The first objective was straightforward: establish the final verified movements of the 15-year-old. Investigators revisited every location connected to his day, speaking once more with co-workers, customers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with him. Memories were compared carefully, not because any single observation appeared remarkable, but because experience had taught detectives that seemingly insignificant details often became critical later. Witnesses consistently described Robert in much the same way. He had completed his duties normally. He had spoken politely with customers. He had appeared relaxed and optimistic. Nothing suggested he intended to run away or abandon the life he had built. His plans extended beyond that afternoon. School, work, family, and the approaching Christmas holiday all pointed toward a future he expected to continue living. One detail, however, surfaced repeatedly. Before leaving work, Robert had mentioned that he intended to meet a local contractor regarding a possible job opportunity. The contractor's name was John Wayne Gacy. As investigators traced that lead, they approached it the same way they would approach any other last-known contact. Detectives sought to verify times, locations, and conversations. At that point, the goal was not to accuse but to understand. A reliable timeline often begins with ordinary interviews. Gacy agreed to speak with investigators. On the surface, there was little about him that immediately attracted suspicion. He presented himself as a successful businessman whose construction company regularly hired young workers. He answered questions calmly and projected the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with clients, employees, and public officials. To neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared to be a productive member of the community. Yet experienced investigators knew that first impressions were only one piece of an inquiry. As interviews continued, detectives focused less on personalities and more on consistency. Every statement would eventually be compared against witness accounts, documented timelines, and physical evidence. Small discrepancies, even those that seemed insignificant on their own, could become important once placed alongside other facts. Meanwhile, officers expanded their search for Robert. Friends were interviewed again. Areas he was known to visit were checked. Additional witnesses were asked whether they had seen him after he left the pharmacy. Flyers bearing his photograph began appearing throughout the community, transforming a local investigation into a shared concern. Residents who had never met the Piest family now recognized Robert's face from bulletin boards, storefront windows, and newspaper coverage. The response reflected the close-knit nature of the suburb. People searched because they believed someone so young should have been home by now. Parents paid closer attention when their own children came through the front door after school. Conversations around dinner tables often returned to the same unsettling question: how could someone disappear in the middle of an ordinary day? As media interest slowly increased, detectives worked carefully to separate verified information from speculation. Rumors spread quickly in close communities, particularly when a teenager vanished without explanation. Some stories conflicted with established facts. Others added confusion without contributing useful information. Investigators understood that maintaining accuracy would be essential if the case were to move forward successfully. Behind the scenes, the inquiry became increasingly methodical. Every interview was documented. Every timeline was refined. Every confirmed movement either strengthened or eliminated a possible explanation. Although the investigation was still in its early stages, one realization had already begun to emerge. Robert's disappearance did not appear to be an isolated puzzle with a simple solution. The more detectives examined the available evidence, the more they sensed that important pieces remained hidden beyond their immediate reach. For the Piest family, each passing day deepened the emotional burden. Hope had not disappeared, but it now existed alongside an exhausting uncertainty. Without answers, every telephone call interrupted silence with possibility. Every update from investigators carried equal measures of anticipation and apprehension. Detectives, too, recognized that time mattered. If Robert was alive, every hour counted. If a crime had occurred, evidence could disappear, memories could fade, and opportunities to uncover the truth could be lost. Those realities drove the investigation forward with increasing urgency. No one involved could yet see the full picture. The evidence was incomplete, the timeline still contained unanswered questions, and the significance of certain observations would only become clear later. But the inquiry was beginning to gather momentum, steadily moving beyond a single missing person case toward discoveries that would fundamentally reshape investigators' understanding of what had been happening in the Chicago area for years. The breakthrough had not yet arrived. But the path leading to it had begun to take shape, one carefully documented interview, one verified fact, and one unanswered question at a time. The days following Robert Piest's disappearance carried a growing sense of uncertainty that was difficult for anyone in the community to ignore. At first, people hoped the mystery would resolve itself. They imagined a simple explanation waiting somewhere ahead: a misunderstanding, an unexpected delay, a decision Robert would later explain with an apologetic smile. But as time passed, that comforting possibility became harder to hold on to. A missing teenager creates a unique kind of silence. It is not the silence of acceptance, because the family still believes their loved one will return. It is not the silence of closure, because there are no answers. It is a silence filled with questions that repeat endlessly. Where did he go? Who was the last person to see him? What happened during those final hours? For investigators, the search became a process of rebuilding Robert's final known movements piece by piece. Every conversation mattered. Every timeline had to be checked. Every person connected to his disappearance needed to be understood. The investigation continued to focus on the last confirmed information available. Robert had left work intending to speak with John Wayne Gacy about a possible employment opportunity. That connection brought detectives back to Gacy's home and business activities. At the time, there was still no complete picture. Investigators were not looking at a finished story. They were looking at fragments, pieces that did not yet reveal what they would eventually become. Gacy continued to present himself as a businessman cooperating with authorities. To many people who knew him, he was still the same person they had seen for years, a local contractor, a neighbor, someone involved in community activities. That contrast would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. The difference between reputation and reality. The difference between what people believed they knew and what remained hidden. As detectives examined the circumstances surrounding Robert's disappearance, they began paying closer attention to details that had previously seemed ordinary. The people who interacted with Gacy were interviewed. His movements were reviewed. Investigators looked for anything that might explain why a teenager who intended to return home had never arrived. The process required patience. Criminal investigations rarely unfold like stories with immediate answers. More often, they move through uncertainty, with investigators collecting small pieces of information that only gain meaning when placed together. A statement from one person. A record from another. A detail remembered days later. A question that leads to another question. Slowly, the picture begins to change. As the investigation developed, authorities obtained the legal authority necessary to examine areas connected to the case more closely. What they expected to find, and what they ultimately discovered, would transform the investigation from a missing person search into something far larger. The suburban home on Summerdale Avenue, which had once appeared completely ordinary, became the center of national attention. The image of normal suburban life began to fracture. Neighbors who had passed the property countless times began looking at it differently. A house that had blended into the landscape suddenly represented unanswered questions and painful revelations. The familiar streets, once associated with everyday routines, became connected to one of the most shocking investigations in American history. For law enforcement officers entering that next stage, the responsibility was enormous. They were no longer searching only for answers about Robert. They were confronting the possibility that multiple families had been waiting for answers for years. Behind every missing person report was a person with a name, a family, memories, and a future that had been interrupted. Investigators understood that their work was not simply about solving a case. It was about giving families information they had been denied for far too long. The discovery process changed the direction of everything. The investigation expanded rapidly. More resources were assigned. More records were reviewed. More questions emerged. And as those questions grew, investigators began realizing that Robert Piest's disappearance was not an isolated event. It was the doorway into a much deeper investigation, one that would force authorities to revisit old assumptions, reconnect forgotten cases, and examine how many warning signs had gone unnoticed. The community that had once believed it understood its surroundings was now facing an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the most important truths are not hidden in distant places. Sometimes they exist in the spaces people walk past every day. And sometimes, the search for one missing person reveals the stories of many others who had been waiting silently to be found. When investigators began looking deeper into the disappearance of Robert Piest, they entered a world defined by uncertainty. The first days of any major investigation are rarely filled with clear answers. They are filled with possibilities, some realistic, some unlikely, and many that eventually lead nowhere. Detectives learn quickly that every missing person case begins with the same difficult task, separating what is known from what is only assumed. In Robert's case, the known facts were painfully limited. A teenager had left work. He had mentioned a possible job opportunity. He had not returned home. And somewhere between those ordinary moments, something had changed. The investigation moved forward through interviews, records, and careful reconstruction of events. Detectives spoke with people who had known Robert, people who had interacted with him that day, and people connected to the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. Every conversation carried the same purpose: finding the missing piece that could explain what had happened. At the center of the investigation was John Wayne Gacy. For investigators, examining Gacy's background became a necessary step. They looked beyond his public image as a businessman and examined the details of his personal history. A person's reputation could provide context, but it could not replace evidence. The deeper detectives looked, the more complicated the picture became. Gacy was not an unknown figure living outside society. He was someone who had spent years building relationships within his community. He had employees, neighbors, acquaintances, and people who had interacted with him regularly. That reality created one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation. How could someone connected to so many people remain hidden for so long? The answer lay partly in the way society viewed danger during that era. Many people imagined criminals as obvious outsiders, individuals who looked suspicious, acted unpredictably, or existed far away from normal life. The possibility that serious wrongdoing could exist behind a familiar face in a familiar neighborhood was difficult for many to accept. Investigators, however, could not rely on assumptions. They had to follow evidence. As they reviewed information connected to Gacy, they examined inconsistencies, verified statements, and compared accounts from different sources. Each detail was evaluated carefully. A single unusual fact was not enough to establish the truth. But when multiple details began pointing in the same direction, they demanded attention. The investigation expanded beyond Robert's disappearance. Authorities began examining whether other missing person cases from previous years might share connections. This was a difficult process. During the 1970s, law enforcement agencies did not have the same digital systems and instant information sharing available today. Records were often stored separately between departments and jurisdictions. A missing teenager from one area might never be connected with a similar disappearance several miles away. Families often searched alone. Detectives often worked with incomplete information. Patterns that seem obvious years later were far harder to recognize at the time. As investigators revisited old reports, they encountered stories of young men whose lives had ended abruptly without explanation. Behind every name was a family that had spent months or years wondering what happened. Some parents kept photographs displayed in their homes. Some continued hoping for a phone call. Some searched for answers long after others had moved on. The investigation into Gacy began bringing those forgotten stories back into focus. For detectives, this created a profound responsibility. They were no longer dealing with a single unanswered question. They were confronting the possibility that multiple families had been waiting for justice. The work became emotionally demanding. Investigators had to remain objective while understanding the human cost behind every file. They were not simply reviewing documents or examining evidence. They were looking into the lives of people who had been loved, missed, and remembered. Each name represented more than a case number. Each disappearance represented a person. As the investigation progressed, the public became increasingly aware that something significant was unfolding. News reports attracted attention beyond the local community. Residents who once viewed the case as a distant tragedy began following each development closely. The image of a quiet suburban neighborhood had changed. The questions surrounding Summerdale Avenue became questions asked across the country. How could this happen? How long had warning signs existed? What could have been discovered earlier? Those questions would continue long after the investigation ended. For the detectives working the case, however, the focus remained on the immediate task, uncovering the truth. They followed leads. They reviewed evidence. They challenged assumptions. And slowly, the investigation moved closer toward a breakthrough that would finally reveal the full scope of what had been hidden for years. But before answers came, there was still a long road ahead, one filled with difficult discoveries, painful confirmations, and the realization that the search for Robert Piest had opened a much larger investigation than anyone originally imagined. Every major investigation reaches a moment when the direction changes. Sometimes it happens because of a single piece of evidence. Sometimes it comes from a witness who finally decides to speak. Sometimes it emerges from dozens of small details that, when placed together, reveal a pattern that had been invisible for years. For the investigators working on the disappearance of Robert Piest, that moment arrived after days of uncertainty, interviews, and unanswered questions. Until then, the case had been defined by what was missing. A missing teenager. A missing timeline. Missing explanations. But slowly, the investigation began shifting from searching for information to understanding what that information meant. The focus on John Wayne Gacy became increasingly significant. What had initially been a routine effort to speak with the last known person connected to Robert's disappearance evolved into a much broader examination of Gacy's background, activities, and possible connections to other unresolved cases. Investigators were no longer looking only at one event. They were looking for patterns. The process required patience and discipline. In criminal investigations, suspicion is not the same as proof. Detectives must move carefully, because every decision affects real people, victims, families, and communities searching for answers. The investigation team knew that emotions were running high. The public wanted explanations. Families wanted closure. News organizations wanted developments. But inside the investigation, facts came first. Every claim had to be verified. Every timeline had to be examined. Every piece of evidence had to withstand scrutiny. As authorities continued gathering information, they began uncovering a reality far larger than anyone had anticipated. The disappearance of Robert Piest appeared to connect with questions that had remained unanswered for years. The names of other missing young men resurfaced. Old reports were reopened. Previous assumptions were reconsidered. Cases that had once existed separately began to appear connected by similarities that demanded further examination. For investigators, This was both a breakthrough and a painful realization. A breakthrough because the investigation was finally moving toward answers. Painful because those answers suggested that many families had been carrying unanswered grief for far too long. Behind every reopened file was a human story. A teenager who had dreams. A young man who had friends. A family who had waited. The investigation became a reminder that missing person cases are not simply records stored in offices. They are unfinished chapters in real lives. As authorities continued their work, the public perception of the case changed dramatically. The story was no longer only about a missing teenager from a Chicago suburb. It had become a national investigation that raised difficult questions about trust, awareness, and how easily a person could hide behind a carefully maintained public image. Neighbors who had once viewed Gacy as familiar began reconsidering their memories. A conversation. A brief interaction. A moment that once seemed meaningless. People searched their own experiences for signs they might have overlooked. This reaction was common in communities affected by major crimes. After the truth emerges, people often revisit the past searching for clues that were invisible at the time. They wonder whether something could have been noticed earlier or whether a different question might have changed the outcome. But investigations rarely provide such simple answers. People make decisions based on the information available to them at that moment. The challenge for detectives was not to rewrite the past. It was to uncover the truth in the present. As evidence continued to accumulate, investigators prepared for the next stage. The case required careful documentation and extensive examination. The discoveries being made would need to be supported by facts that could withstand legal challenges. A successful investigation is not only about finding answers. It is about proving those answers. That distinction would become crucial as the case moved toward the courtroom. The breakthrough changed everything. The uncertainty surrounding Robert Piest's disappearance had begun to give way to a larger understanding of what investigators were facing. The quiet suburban streets that once represented safety had become the setting for a case that would permanently alter the way many Americans thought about crime. It also changed the way law enforcement approached missing person investigations. The case demonstrated the importance of connecting information across jurisdictions, reviewing older disappearances, and recognizing that patterns may exist even when individual cases appear unrelated. For the families searching for loved ones, however, the investigation was not about history or statistics. It was about names. It was about memories. It was about people who deserved to be remembered not only because of how they were lost, but because of who they had been. As investigators moved closer to presenting their findings, one truth became increasingly clear. The search for Robert Piest had uncovered something much larger than anyone expected. A single disappearance had opened the door to years of unanswered questions. A single investigation had brought forgotten names back into the light. And a community that once believed it understood the world around it was forced to confront a reality that had been hidden in plain sight. The breakthrough had arrived. But with it came a new responsibility, ensuring that the truth would be fully revealed, that the victims would not be forgotten, and that justice would eventually follow. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the world was no longer asking whether John Wayne Gacy was connected to a horrifying series of events. The question before the court had become something more precise and more difficult. Could the state prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was responsible for the crimes he had been accused of committing? A courtroom is different from the streets where an investigation begins. Outside, emotions often move faster than facts. Communities react with anger, fear, and disbelief. Families carry grief that cannot be measured by legal language. News coverage brings the story into millions of homes, creating public opinions long before a verdict is reached. Inside a courtroom, however, the process follows a different path. Every statement must be examined. Every piece of evidence must be questioned. Every conclusion must be supported. Justice depends not only on what people believe happened, but on what can be proven. The trial of John Wayne Gacy became one of the most closely followed criminal proceedings in the United States. The scale of the investigation, the number of victims involved, and the shocking discoveries connected to the case had already captured national attention. Reporters followed every development, and the courtroom became a place where the public searched for answers. For the families of the victims, however, this was never simply a headline. Behind every legal argument was a personal loss. Behind every piece of evidence was a person whose life had been interrupted. Many families had spent years living with unanswered questions. They had waited for information that might never come. They had experienced the painful uncertainty that surrounds a missing loved one, a state between hope and grief where there is no clear ending. The trial represented something important. It was a chance for their stories to be heard. The prosecution's responsibility was to present a complete picture based on evidence gathered during the investigation. Prosecutors carefully explained the timeline of events, the connections between different pieces of information, and the findings that investigators had uncovered. Their argument was built around the idea that the evidence revealed a consistent pattern. The defense approached the case differently. Rather than focusing only on whether the events occurred, the defense challenged questions surrounding Gacy's mental state and whether he could be held fully responsible under the law. The issue of mental responsibility has long been one of the most complex areas of criminal justice because it exists at the intersection of psychology and accountability. A person's mental condition can be important in understanding behavior. But the legal question is more specific. Was the individual capable of understanding their actions and understanding that those actions were wrong? Experts were called to provide their opinions. Their testimony examined Gacy's psychological state and offered competing interpretations. The jury was asked to consider not only what happened, but also how the law should interpret responsibility. Trials involving claims of mental illness often create difficult discussions because they force society to confront complicated questions. How should the justice system respond when someone commits extreme acts? Where is the boundary between understanding behavior and holding someone accountable? Can a person's psychological condition explain actions without excusing them? These questions extended beyond one courtroom. They became part of a larger national conversation. As the trial continued, jurors were presented with extensive evidence collected over the course of the investigation. The process required them to listen carefully, separate emotion from legal standards, and make decisions based on the information presented before them. For the jury, the responsibility was enormous. A verdict would not only determine the legal fate of one person. It would also represent a moment of recognition for many victims whose names had become connected to the case. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and deliberation, the jury reached its decision. The verdict was guilty. The courtroom response reflected years of investigation, grief, and determination. For many families, the decision brought a measure of relief, but it could never erase what had been lost. A conviction can provide accountability. It can confirm the truth. But it cannot return the years taken away from those who were gone. The court sentenced Gacy to death. The sentence represented the strongest punishment available under Illinois law at the time. It reflected the severity of the crimes and the overwhelming evidence presented during the trial. Yet even after the verdict, the story did not truly end. Legal proceedings continued through appeals and reviews, as required by the justice system. Death sentences involve extensive examination because the consequences are irreversible. Courts review whether legal standards were properly followed and whether the rights of the accused were protected throughout the process. This process can be emotionally difficult for victims' families, who may feel that each additional hearing reopens painful memories. But these procedures exist because justice requires both accountability and fairness. The case of John Wayne Gacy became a landmark example of how investigations, courts, and communities respond when confronted with extraordinary criminal cases. It revealed the importance of thorough evidence collection, communication between law enforcement agencies, and attention to missing person cases that might otherwise remain unresolved. Perhaps the most important legacy of the trial was not the attention given to the person convicted. It was the recognition of those whose lives had been taken. For years, many families had lived without answers. The investigation and trial gave names, identities, and stories back to victims who had too often been reduced to statistics. They were not numbers. They were sons, friends, brothers, people with hopes, personalities, and futures. The courtroom established legal responsibility, but the larger work of remembering belonged to society. Because every major criminal case leaves behind two stories. One is the story of the person who committed the crime. The other is the story of the people whose lives were changed forever. The pursuit of justice is ultimately about making sure the second story is never forgotten. The conclusion of a criminal trial often creates the illusion that a story has ended. A verdict is delivered. A sentence is announced. Courtroom doors close. News cameras move on to the next headline. But for the people whose lives were forever changed, there is no final chapter that arrives so neatly. Justice may be recognized in a courtroom, but grief continues in quiet places inside family homes, in old photographs, in memories carried through generations. The case of John Wayne Gacy did not end when the jury reached its decision. For the families of the victims, the years afterward became a different kind of journey. It was a journey not defined by searching for answers, but by learning how to live with the answers they had finally received. For many years, some families had existed in a painful state of uncertainty. When a loved one disappears, the absence itself becomes a constant presence. There is no clear moment of goodbye. No final conversation. No certainty about what happened. Only questions. The investigation changed that reality by bringing information to families who had waited for years. But information, even when it provides closure, can also bring another wave of pain. Learning the truth means confronting the reality that hope alone cannot change. For those families, the most important part of the story was never the person responsible. It was the people who were lost. Each victim had once been a living, breathing part of someone's world. They had childhood memories, friendships, personal dreams, and ordinary moments that mattered deeply to those who loved them. A name on an investigation file represented an entire human life. A photograph represented someone who had once laughed, made plans, and imagined the future. Remembering that became one of the most important responsibilities after the case. Over time, investigators and forensic specialists continued working to identify victims whose identities were not immediately known. Advances in science transformed what was once impossible into something achievable. Modern DNA analysis and improved investigative techniques allowed authorities to revisit old evidence and provide answers that had remained out of reach for decades. The passage of time did not erase the importance of those questions. In some cases, time became the reason answers were finally possible. Families who had waited years received confirmation about loved ones they had never stopped remembering. For them, identification was more than a scientific achievement. It was a restoration of identity. A person who had been missing from history could finally be returned to their family's story. This aspect of the case also highlighted a broader issue within criminal investigations: the importance of taking every missing person report seriously. Many victims of violent crimes come from circumstances where their disappearances may not immediately receive widespread attention. Some are young people who have left home. Some have unstable living situations. Some disappear without a large network of people searching for them. But every missing person has value. Every disappearance represents someone who matters. The investigation into Gacy's crimes contributed to wider discussions about how law enforcement agencies handle missing person cases, share information, and recognize connections between incidents occurring in different locations. The world of criminal investigation has changed dramatically since the late 1970s. Technology now allows agencies to compare information more quickly. Databases help connect cases that might once have remained isolated. DNA technology has transformed forensic identification. Investigators today have tools that previous generations could not have imagined. But technology alone does not solve cases. People do. Detectives who ask difficult questions. Families who refuse to stop searching. Communities that continue demanding answers. The human determination behind every investigation remains the most important element. The case also left society with uncomfortable questions about trust and perception. How often do people judge others based only on appearances? How easily can someone's public image hide parts of their life that remain unknown? How can communities balance trust with awareness? These questions do not have simple answers. A society built entirely on suspicion would become impossible to live in. People must trust teachers, employers, neighbors, and strangers every day. Yet awareness matters. Listening to concerns matters. Taking warning signs seriously matters. The lesson was not that every familiar person should be feared. The lesson was that every person deserves to be seen clearly. Years after the investigation, the name John Wayne Gacy remained connected to one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history. But focusing only on the individual responsible risks, overlooking the people who deserve the greatest attention. The victims were not defined by the way their lives ended. They were defined by the lives they lived before that moment. They were sons who were loved. Friends who were remembered. Young people who had futures ahead of them. Their stories are the reason the investigation mattered. Their families' search for truth is the reason the case continues to be studied. And their memory is the reason the final chapter should never belong only to the person who caused the tragedy. In the end, the story of this case is not simply about darkness hidden behind an ordinary appearance. It is also about the determination of people who searched for answers when answers seemed impossible to find. It is about investigators who followed evidence through uncertainty. It is about families who carried grief while continuing to seek the truth. It is about victims whose identities and stories refused to disappear. The most important measure of any investigation is not the attention given to the person responsible. It is whether the people who were harmed are remembered. Decades later, that remains the lasting responsibility. Not to remember the horror, but to remember the humanity that existed before it. There are cases that disappear from public memory with time. A headline fades. A courtroom closes. A documentary ends. The world moves forward. But some stories remain because they represent something larger than the events themselves. They force society to examine uncomfortable questions, to confront failures that were once overlooked, and to remember the people whose lives were changed forever. The case of John Wayne Gacy remains one of those stories. Decades have passed since investigators first uncovered the truth hidden beneath an ordinary suburban existence. The streets have changed. Buildings have been renovated. New generations have grown up knowing the case only through history books, documentaries, and archives. Yet behind every reference to the investigation are human stories that began long before anyone knew those names. The victims were not created by the tragedy that surrounded them. They existed before it. They had childhood memories. They had favorite songs. They had people who cared about them. They had dreams that extended beyond the moment when their lives were interrupted. That is the part of the story that deserves the greatest attention. Because crime often has a way of changing the way people are remembered. A person can become connected forever to the circumstances of their disappearance or death, and the details of the case can overshadow everything that came before. But a life is always larger than its final chapter. Every victim was someone's family member. Someone's friend. Someone who once walked through the world unnoticed, carrying ordinary hopes and ordinary worries. The tragedy is not only that their lives ended. It is that the world lost the chance to see what those lives could have become. For investigators, the case became a lesson in the importance of connection. A single agency rarely sees the entire picture. One missing person report may seem isolated. One unanswered question may appear unrelated to another. But patterns exist. Connections exist. And sometimes finding the truth requires looking beyond individual cases and recognizing the larger human story. The investigation influenced how law enforcement agencies approached missing person cases and information sharing. It demonstrated the importance of cooperation between departments, careful documentation, and the willingness to revisit unanswered questions. The tools have changed since the 1970s. Today, investigators have technology that previous generations could only imagine. Digital records, advanced forensic methods, and improved communication systems have transformed the way cases are examined. But the foundation remains the same. Curiosity. Persistence. The determination to keep searching when answers are difficult to find. Those qualities often belong not only to investigators but also to families. Families are frequently the first people who refuse to let a missing person become just another file. They keep photographs. They tell stories. They preserve memories. They continue asking questions when others have moved on. Their persistence keeps names alive. It reminds society that every missing person represents a life that mattered. The legacy of this case is complicated. It is a story about criminal justice, but it is also a story about the limitations of human perception. It reminds us that people are often judged by what they show the world. A friendly conversation, a respected occupation, or involvement in the community can create an image of trust. But appearances alone never reveal the complete truth about anyone. Understanding that does not mean living in constant fear. It means paying attention. It means taking concerns seriously. It means remembering that behind every investigation are real people whose voices deserve to be heard. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from this case is not about the person responsible. It is about the importance of the people who continued searching. The detectives who followed every lead. The families who demanded answers. The communities that refused to forget. Justice is not only a verdict delivered in a courtroom. Justice is also memory. It is the decision to say that a person's life mattered even after the world tried to reduce them to a statistic. Years after the investigation ended, the names connected to this case continue to be remembered. Not because of the circumstances surrounding their loss, but because every name represents a life that existed before tragedy. A story that began with disappearance ultimately became a reminder of the value of recognition, of listening, of searching, of remembering. The darkest investigations in history often reveal something important about humanity. They show the damage caused when warning signs are ignored, but they also reveal the strength of those who continue looking for truth. And in the end, that is where the focus should remain. Not on the person who caused suffering, but on the people who deserved more time, more memories, more years, more life. Their stories are the ones worth carrying forward. History often remembers moments of tragedy by the names attached to them. A date, a location, a person responsible, a headline that captures attention for a brief moment before the world moves on. But behind every infamous case exists another story, a quieter story that does not always receive the same attention. The story of the people who were left behind. When a crime becomes nationally known, there is a risk that the person responsible becomes the center of the narrative. Their actions are studied. Their background is analyzed. Their name appears repeatedly in books, documentaries, and conversations. But the true measure of a society is not how well it remembers those who caused harm. It is how carefully it remembers those who suffered because of it. The victims connected to this case were not symbols. They were individuals. Before investigators knew their names, before newspapers printed their stories, before their lives became connected to one of the most infamous investigations in American history, they were simply people living ordinary days. They woke up in the morning. They spoke with friends. They made plans. They imagined futures. They experienced moments that seemed insignificant at the time but became precious memories for those who loved them. That is what gets lost when a tragedy becomes a headline. The ordinary humanity that existed before the tragedy. For the families, remembering was never about the investigation alone. It was about preserving pieces of the people they lost. A photograph on a shelf. A story repeated during family gatherings. A favorite expression that someone still remembers decades later. These small details are often what keep a person present. Not the circumstances of their disappearance. Not the details of an investigation. But the evidence that they lived. The aftermath of this case also revealed the importance of listening to families of missing people. Often, relatives notice changes before anyone else. They understand routines, personalities, and behaviors in ways that outsiders cannot. When someone disappears, families are not simply asking for information. They are asking the world to recognize that someone important is missing. That recognition can determine how quickly a case receives attention and resources. Over time, investigations across the country have evolved. Law enforcement agencies have developed stronger methods for sharing information, reviewing old cases, and using forensic science to identify victims. But technology is only one part of the solution. The human element remains essential. Someone has to ask the next question. Someone has to notice the connection. Someone has to believe that an unanswered case is still worth pursuing. The story of this investigation continues to be studied because it exposed weaknesses that existed within systems designed to protect people. It showed how easily information could become separated, how assumptions could delay understanding, and how important it is to look beyond the surface. But it also showed something else. It showed perseverance. Years after the initial investigation, professionals continued working to identify victims and provide answers. Advances in science allowed some mysteries to be resolved long after the original events occurred. Those moments carried a powerful meaning. For families who had waited decades, a name was not just a name. It was a connection restored. It was a missing piece returned. It was recognition that someone they loved had not been forgotten. The passage of time changes many things. Cities grow. Neighborhoods transform. People who once witnessed events firsthand eventually grow older. But the search for truth can continue. Memory can continue. Respect can continue. Perhaps that is the most important lesson left behind by cases like this. The pursuit of justice is not only about punishment. It is about responsibility. Responsibility to investigate. Responsibility to remember. Responsibility to ensure that those who were lost are not reduced to numbers in a historical record. Every major criminal case eventually reaches a point where the public conversation begins to fade. New events replace old ones. New stories take attention away. But forgetting is different from moving forward. A society can move forward while still remembering. It can learn without becoming trapped in the past. It can acknowledge tragedy without allowing tragedy to define everything that came before. The final chapter of this story should not belong to the person whose actions created suffering. It should belong to the people whose lives mattered. The families who waited. The investigators who searched. The communities that demanded answers. And the victims whose names deserve to exist beyond the circumstances that brought them into history. Because the most meaningful way to remember a tragedy is not to preserve the darkness. It is to protect the light that existed before it. To remember that every life lost was once a life being lived. And that every person, no matter how they are remembered by history, deserves to be remembered first as human. Some stories end when the final page is turned. Others continue because the questions they raise remain important long after the people involved are gone. The case of John Wayne Gacy belongs to the second category. Decades after the investigation shocked the nation, people continue studying it not because of the individual at the center of the crimes, but because of what the case revealed about communities, law enforcement, and the lasting impact of unanswered questions. At its heart, this was never only a story about a criminal investigation. It was a story about people searching for the truth. It was a story about families who refused to let their loved ones disappear into silence. It was a story about investigators who had to navigate uncertainty while carrying the responsibility of finding answers. And it was a story about how society responds when the unimaginable happens in an ordinary place. One of the most difficult lessons from cases like this is understanding that tragedy does not always arrive in obvious ways. Communities often imagine danger as something distant, something that belongs somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar. But history has repeatedly shown that serious crimes can exist within ordinary environments. That realization can be uncomfortable because it challenges the sense of safety people build around their daily lives. Yet awareness does not have to mean fear. The purpose of remembering cases like this is not to create suspicion toward everyone around us. It is to encourage attention, responsibility, and compassion. It is a reminder to listen when someone raises concerns. It is a reminder that missing people deserve attention regardless of their circumstances. It is a reminder that every investigation represents real human lives. The evolution of forensic science after the 1970s also changed the way unresolved cases are approached. Technologies that did not exist at the time of the original investigation later provided opportunities to revisit evidence and answer questions that had remained unanswered for years. Science became a bridge between the past and the present. A way for investigators to return to old cases with new tools. A way for families to receive information that once seemed impossible to obtain. For many families of missing individuals, answers arrive slowly. Sometimes they come after years. Sometimes after decades. But time does not reduce the importance of the truth. A family waiting for answers today experiences the same uncertainty as a family waiting many years ago. The need for recognition does not expire. The need for justice does not disappear. This case also changed conversations about how communities respond when someone goes missing. It highlighted the importance of communication, cooperation, and recognizing patterns that may not be visible when information remains separated. One missing person report may seem like an isolated tragedy. But behind every report is a person. And behind every person is a network of relationships, memories, and people who care. That understanding has become one of the most important developments in modern investigative work. Numbers alone do not tell the whole story. Statistics cannot describe a parent's worry. A friend's unanswered messages. A family's empty chair at the dinner table. A photograph that remains unchanged while years continue passing. Those human experiences are what give meaning to the pursuit of justice. The passage of time has also changed how society discusses infamous criminal cases. Modern audiences have become more aware of the responsibility involved in telling these stories. There is a difference between studying a crime and becoming fascinated by the person who committed it. There is a difference between understanding history and turning suffering into entertainment. The most respectful approach is to remember why these stories matter. Not because of the person responsible, but because of the lives affected. A responsible telling of true crime should return again and again to the same question. Who were the people behind the headlines? What dreams did they have? Who loved them? What should future generations learn from their stories? Those questions bring humanity back into a narrative that can easily become focused only on darkness. Years later, the legacy of this case is not simply the record of an investigation. It is the reminder that every unanswered question represents someone worth searching for. Every missing person deserves attention. Every victim deserves dignity. Every family deserves compassion. The ultimate measure of justice is not only whether a court reaches a verdict. It is whether society remembers the people who were harmed and learns enough to prevent similar failures in the future. The names connected to this case remain part of history, but history should not preserve only the worst moments of their lives. It should preserve their existence, their identities, their humanity. Because long after investigations end and headlines disappear, that is what remains. Not the fear, not the speculation, but the responsibility to remember. Every investigation begins with questions. A name. A missing person. A moment when something ordinary suddenly becomes impossible to explain. For the families connected to this case, the beginning was not a headline. It was not a national conversation. It was a quiet moment when someone they loved did not come home. That is where every true story of loss begins. Not with the investigation. Not with the courtroom. Not with the media coverage. It begins with a person. A son. A friend. A brother. Someone whose absence created a space that could never truly be filled. Over time, the world often remembers major criminal cases through the details of the investigation. Dates, locations, evidence, and legal decisions become part of the historical record. But behind every fact is a human experience. Behind every report is a family waiting. Behind every photograph is a person who once had plans for tomorrow. The passage of time can change many things. Communities grow older. Buildings are replaced. Memories become stories passed from one generation to another. But the importance of remembering does not fade. If anything, time makes remembrance more important. Because history has a tendency to simplify complicated events. It turns years of human lives into a few sentences. It turns individuals into names connected to a single tragedy. That is why responsible storytelling matters. A case like this should never be remembered only for the person who caused suffering. It should be remembered for those who were affected. For the families who continued searching for answers. For the investigators who followed evidence through uncertainty. For the victims whose lives contained meaning long before they became part of a criminal investigation. The work of justice is often described as a search for truth. But truth is more than discovering what happened. Truth also means recognizing who was affected. It means acknowledging the pain carried by families. It means understanding that behind every investigation file is a story that began long before the crime itself. The lessons left behind by this case continue to influence conversations about missing person investigations, forensic science, and the importance of cooperation between agencies. But perhaps the most important lesson is simpler. People matter. Every missing person matters. Every unanswered question matters. Every family waiting for information matters. The systems created to protect communities are strongest when they remember the human beings at the center of every case. Technology can help uncover evidence. Procedures can guide investigations. Laws can establish accountability. But compassion is what gives those efforts meaning. The history of criminal justice is filled with cases that changed how society understands danger, responsibility, and prevention. Some cases expose failures. Others reveal improvements that become possible afterward. The hope is that painful lessons do not remain only painful. The hope is that they lead to better awareness, better communication, better protection for future generations. The story surrounding John Wayne Gacy remains one of the most widely known criminal investigations in American history. But the final message should not be about the scale of the crimes or the notoriety of the person responsible. The final message should be about remembrance. Because the people connected to this case were more than victims in an investigation. They were individuals with personalities, relationships, and dreams. They were people who mattered to others. And that truth existed before the tragedy, during the search for answers, and long after the courtroom proceedings ended. A society reveals its values through what it chooses to remember. It can remember the shocking details that attract attention. Or it can remember the human lives behind those details. The second choice is the one that carries the greatest meaning. Because justice is not only about holding someone accountable. Justice is also about refusing to let innocent lives disappear from memory. Years may pass. Generations may change. The world may move forward. But as long as people continue telling these stories with dignity and respect, those who were lost remain present in the only way history allows. Through remembrance. Through compassion. Through the simple recognition that every life has a story worth telling. And in the end, that is where this story truly belongs. Not in darkness. Not in fear. But in the memory of the people whose lives deserved to continue.